Now let's talk about fertility, which is a subject that makes everybody a bit nervous, but it's been in the news rather a lot this year, and there's a lot of talk about demography and the developed world's great problems with reproduction, human reproduction. Lionel Shriver, who is never afraid to tackle any difficult subject, our great columnist, of course, has written about this in the magazine this week. The article is titled "The Demographics That May Shape Europe." I'm joined by Lionel now and Britain's leading demographer, Paul Morland, who is the author of a new book called No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. Lionel, I will start with you. People are nervous to talk about this subject, but it has bubbled up in the news this year a bit more than normal, I would say. Why do you think that is? Why has it bubbled up so much?
Well, what the peg for a lot of these big features has been the fact that on a global level, on average, we have either just crossed or are about to cross into below replacement rate. What I wrote about this month is the fact that these articles consistently gloss over the big exception to this rule. After all, this is just a global average. The exception is Africa. And Africa is still growing enormously. It's about 1.5 billion people now. It should be 2.5 billion by 2050, which is not very far away anymore. And by 2100 is expected to be nearly 4 billion people. And it could be even higher. So I'm looking at when we don't do the global average anymore, and we're looking at how different parts of the world are reproducing or failing to. Africa has a lot of problems. It's still very poor. It has huge water problems, even without any kind of climate change. It has poor governance and endemic corruption. It's a hard place to live, and the incentive to migrate elsewhere is enormous. And therefore, I don't believe that the continent is likely to be able to support anywhere near 4 billion people. After all, that is about half the population of the current whole world. So what are they most likely to do? I would say go nearby. That's Europe. And, we're not talking about it. This is not widely known or widely acknowledged, and it is politically awkward. It is necessarily already politically fraught because of the racial element. So that's one reason we're not talking about it, and that's why the column is a little bit dangerous.
Paul, could you possibly shed some light for us on why it is that sub-Saharan Africa is still relatively it's booming as a population, whereas Europe in particular is in decline? I think the usual argument is it's to do with the infant mortality. There's been a dip in infant mortality in Africa, and this often means a boom, a population boom, does it not?
Well, I often talk about pre-modern, modern and post-modern demography. So pre-modern was the world that everyone lived in before about 1800, the world Malthus described and thought was perennial, breeding like flies, dying like rabbits, and a relatively low population. It took 2 millennia for the population of the world to grow from about 250 million in the time of Julius Caesar to about 1 billion in the time of Queen Victoria. So that's a very long time to quadruple. And if people have 6 children on average per couple, they'd have got there in 75 years or so, not in 2000. So in a pre-modern demography, there's a lot of winnowing going on, high birth rate, very high death rate. Africa is now going through the process of modern demography, that process which most of us have been through already, where mortality rates tumble, particularly infant mortality rates. It's not that African families are getting bigger. They've always been big, but sadly, many, many children have died before reaching reproductive age. That's changing. Still high infant mortality in Africa, but tumbling just about everywhere. And that means massive population growth, even if tomorrow Africans adopted small family sizes. And then when you're in postmodern demography, it's not where we are, and most of the world is now, it's not about that process anymore. It's not about economic progress. We're all kind of through that. And the question is, what are our fertility choices? And I suppose the one thing missing from what Lionel's already said is that in Europe and much of East Asia, Latin America, more and more of the world, even quite poor parts of the world, people are choosing to have very small families. So the concomitant of this potential massive movement out of Africa into Europe is the fact that for a couple of generations, Europeans have not been replacing themselves, which for sure Europeans and East Asians at their level of development are not going to be having 6 or 7 children each. But with very, very low infant mortality in the developed world, if we had 2 or 3, we'd been absolutely fine. But of course, we're not having that number. The number is falling. And we're really feeling now the effects of a lack of people coming into the labour force.
The way it's happened in the States, for example, we've let in huge numbers of low-skilled immigrants, undereducated. Now, they are working in the pork processing plants in Iowa, and similar, often rather arduous and unpleasant jobs. But and that's a boon for the pork processing company. But it's not necessarily a boon for the larger society. Your pork chops are a little bit cheaper. But in the big picture, the taxpayer is out of luck, because the taxpayer will be subsidizing that person's health care and education, and often even subsidizing wages with supplementary tax. It's called tax supplement, but it isn't. I mean, they're not really paying taxes, and they're not really covering their costs. So what we're doing is supplementing the industry. And I'm afraid that the kind of immigration that is going to be pressing on Europe's borders is going to be of the same sort. There are going to be certain industries that say, look, we need people to clean our hotel rooms.
Yes.
But it would be better socially, on an economic level, to start paying a great deal more for cleaning hotel rooms, and then entice your local population to do those jobs. And that way the taxpayer doesn't subsidize the hotel.
And at a macro level, of course, it means you do get a larger GDP, but not a larger per capita GDP, which is what we've seen in the UK. It also means that there is a disincentive to invest in labour replacing technology, because labour is perennially cheap when you can just turn on the tap. And I would add, earlier this week I was talking to a SPAD, a political advisor for a cabinet minister, who was confirming what I've always understood is the case, that although there's a huge pressure from the electorate to reduce the inflow of immigration, senior politicians are under huge pressure from business to keep the tap flowing. And as Lionel has said, that may be in the interests of the individual businesses and their P&Ls, but it's not necessarily positive from a general social perspective or a national economic perspective.
That's a fascinating point. Your book your new book is saying, or your latest book, I should say, is saying that the world needs more children, and it seems as though this year quite a few people are coming round to this argument. But the big question is, how do we go about achieving this? And obviously there are natalist policies that various countries have tried. Could you give us a sort of a quick rundown of which ones have been successful and which ones haven't?
Well, just to be clear, my book's actually out in July, on the 4th of July, as it happens, which I hope will give Lionel a double reason for celebration. And the penultimate chapter is what government can do for us, and the last chapter is what can we do for ourselves. So on the government chapter, I look at the various policies that have been tried over time. Classically, Hungary at the moment, for example, offers home loans, which get written off if you have 3 children or more, subsidised childcare. All these sorts of things seem to have only a marginal benefit, and Hungary's got its fertility rate up, but not significantly more than those of surrounding countries, and it's still way, way too low. So I think government throwing money at the problem is of limited benefit, unless what they're throwing money at is a society with a very high requirement desire to have children. Now, if you ask women how many children they have in the UK and the US, they say 2 to 3. But they're not having them. Now, we know that, therefore, they'll say, well, it's about housing, it's about childcare costs, and these are important things. But then if you look where childcare is very subsidised, as in Germany, or where housing is cheap in parts of the UK, you'll find that the fertility rate is still low. So I don't want to say governments don't bother about those things, but I think those things alone will not fix the problem. The first thing to fix the problem, I think, is having a society in which people genuinely want children very much and put it as a very high priority. And then I think government can work with that, nudge the culture in that direction. But I think there's a limit to what it can do just by subsidising and making housing cheaper and encouraging people to, women to go into the workforce and subsidising childcare. Positive though all those things are, I think we actually need a change of heart as a society, and we need to understand that if we want a future as a nation, as a culture, then we have to reproduce ourselves to provide the people who will continue to bear that culture. Now, some people may not want that, some people may not care, and it may well be that when a society or a culture ceases to wish or care about replacing itself, it will cease to exist.
I don't think you can get away from the fact, and I totally agree with Paul, that a lot of what drives fertility is values. And, you know, many people look at Africa and think, oh, the only reason they're having large families is that they don't have access to contraception. And that's not really true. And that's been borne out by polls asking Africans how many children they want. And in many instances, they're not actually having as many as they would like. You know, they don't want to average 5.5 children. They want 6 children. And that's because, by and large, the cultures in that continent place a huge value on family and on having children. And having a large family is high status. Whereas if you have a large family in the West right now, you're kind of weird. And people are going to look at you like, what's your problem? And I mean, there was one of these valedictory college speeches recently. I don't remember who it was. Some sports person in the U.S. this month who gave a speech saying, you know, it was old-fashioned, yeah, but saying, you know, women who are graduating today. Many of you are going to go on to have careers, but I'm sure many others of you are looking forward to marrying and having children, and that's where you'll find your calling. And there was absolute outrage across the country. Now, I have a career, and I didn't have any kids, so I'm definitely part of the problem. But it is interesting that you get that bad a backlash politically and culturally when you have someone promoting the idea that you might center the value of your life in your family. Whereas in Africa, that's totally normal. And how you subtly change the value system of an entire culture, and I'm talking about ours, I don't know. It's difficult. And it's not something that government can necessarily impose.
Paul, do you agree with that? And if I can push it a bit further, do you think feminism is compatible with a society that reproduces itself at sufficient levels?
Well, let me start about agreeing with Lionel. I want to make a point on race, actually, because if we'd been having this conversation 30 or 40 years ago, people would say, oh, that's just white people worrying about not enough white people. This is not a white issue. If you go to large parts of South America, if you go to Jamaica, for example, never mind China, Korea, this is becoming a human issue. All these places have way below replacement level fertility rates, even, as I said, some quite poor places like Jamaica, like Thailand. So let's get away from the taboo about it really being about race. We know the Japanese are worrying about it in terms of civilizational collapse, as their prime minister said. We know the Tunisians are worrying about it, and the president of Tunisia has talked about the country being overwhelmed. So this is not any longer a white issue. So I think that should allow us to talk about it more freely, given the taboos that exist in the world today. Now, in terms of feminism, I don't want to roll the world back to 1950 or Britain back to 1950. I am the husband of a very successful, hard-working woman. I have 2 daughters and a son, and both my daughters are pursuing their careers, as well as having had their first children before the age of 30. We're not going back to 1957. So the question then is, and this is one of the chapters in my book, how do we reconcile the kind of feminism that says women need to participate in the workforce, we need them at every level in society, and they need to get educations just as much as men, and then to use those educations in ways as men do to earn their livings, to express themselves, to pursue careers. These are givens. And where in more patriarchal societies like Greece or Japan, where women are not given the opportunity to combine career and family, where you could say feminism has not advanced much, the fertility rate is not very high. It's been traditionally higher in more progressive societies like Sweden or ours or France's. So what we have to do is not go back to 1957, but go forward, as it were, to 2027 and say, how can we imagine a feminism, by which I mean a world in which women are given all the opportunities that men have, and we need them as much as we need men. And at the same time, we work policy and society around the fact that women are going to have children and that they and their partners are going to need to look after their children. We need to go forward rather than backwards in terms of feminism and create a society which is compliant with feminism and gives women opportunities, but at the same time is able to combine that with a fertility rate of 2 to 3 children per woman. And I don't think that should be impossible.
As I understand it, the real problem in the West is not so much that women just don't want children anymore. It's that they're putting childbearing off. The chances of your having any children are only about 50% once you've crossed the age of 30. And if you poll women, they're not having as many children as they actually want. And maybe most of all, we need to get across the message that if you do want to have a family, don't put it off. And, you know, that means slightly reorganizing how women pursue their careers. There's no real getting away from the fact that having children, it interferes with your career. I mean, it takes time. You're going to take time off. Your employer's not going to like it. But this whole pattern we've developed in the West, whereby, oh, you have to get your career on track. You have to establish yourself, and then you'll have children. That's not working.
Mm. Finally, Paul, I just wanted to ask you quickly, sperm counts. We read a lot about declining sperm counts. Is a lot of this sort of media tittle-tattle, fear-mongering, or is that a significant problem that means that even if we do create a society that is pro-natalist, that's pro lots of people having lots of children, we might not be able to do it?
I think the best analogy would be that we're in a ship which has got a hole and it's sinking. And it happens to be heading for an iceberg, or maybe not heading for an iceberg. That's a scientific discussion about sperm count, which I'm not really qualified to comment on. There does seem to be an issue. But as things stand at the moment, we haven't hit the iceberg. Sperm counts are high enough that the vast majority of people in the right conditions at an appropriate age can conceive. So that may be a problem down the road, but sperm count is not today the reason why in Korea, for example, they're having 2/3 of a child per woman. That means every cohort is 1/3 of the size of the last. So we're already taking in vast amounts of water, as it were. We're sinking, and we're standing on the deck debating whether there's an iceberg ahead.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we will end it there. But Lionel and Paul, thank you very much for coming on to Spectator TV.
Thank you.
Thank you.